Now, I mentioned that the Old Testament is written in Hebrew and Aramaic, the New Testament in Greek, but for most of the church age, this was not the case. Latin was the language that was used by the church, and the scripture had to be translated from the Greek and the Hebrew into Latin in order that the church could use it. Now, this process was done by a person by the name of Jerome. Jerome was able to translate the New Testament from Greek into Latin, and then he traveled to the city of Bethlehem in Israel and studied Hebrew with the rabbis who lived there so that he could better understand the Old Testament. This project was completed about 400 A.D. This means that from 400 A.D. until the 13th, 14th century, everything was in Latin. This meant that most of the people could not understand the scripture. What they would do would be to go to the church for Mass or whatever service was going on. The pastor or the priest would speak in Latin, and they would supposed to be able to understand what he said. It became evident, especially for the church in England, that most of the people did not know Latin that well. So there are some people who began to make it easier for them. And one of these was Wycliffe. Now, Wycliffe did a translation of the New Testament in the 14th century. That's 1380. What he would do would be to take the text that was used in the church that Sunday, and he would translate it from Latin into English. This translation then was given to his followers, who were called Lollards, and they would go out and then they would preach this message to the people in the various villages. Notice that the translation was done from the Latin into English. The Wycliffe Bible was updated by John Purvey. He revised the Wycliffe translation in 1388. William Tyndale came along in 1526 and published a New Testament in English, which was taken from the Greek text. This was a big improvement because there were times when the Latin Vulgate did not agree with the Greek of the New Testament. Tyndale was opposed by the church, and so he went to Germany to continue his work. In Germany, he was betrayed and arrested. He was tried, and he was burned at the stake. The last words of Tyndale was, "Lord, open the eyes of the King of England." And this happened. In the next year, the king approved an English text to be used. Miles Coverdale, a follower of Tyndale, produced the Coverdale Bible in 1535. Now, this was the Tyndale New Testament, and then the work done in the Old Testament by Tyndale, and then the rest of it, a translation taken from the Latin. John Rogers produced the Matthew Bible in 1537, and he used a pen name, Thomas Matthew. because he was afraid of the authorities, so he didn't use his own name. Coverdale then revised the Matthew Bible, 1539, and this was referred to as the Great Bible. This was the first English translation authorized to be read in the Church of England. Now, one of the reasons why it was called the Great Bible is because of the size. There was a Bible that was placed in the church, chained to the pulpit. So if a person wanted to use it, he had to go to the church and read it there. One of the tragedies of this is that the church still felt that they were the only ones who really knew how to interpret the Scripture, and the interpretation should be left up to them. Have an example of this where we lived in England from 2000 to 2004. William Hunter in Brentwood was a young man of 18, 19, and he would sneak into the church in order to read the Scripture. Well, he was told not to do that. Well, he had other problems with the church, and so he was sent to London, and there he was supposed to change his way. He was to be indoctrinated with the correct interpretation, the correct theology of the church. He would not do what the Catholic Church said. So as a result of this, he was sentenced to be burned at the stake. And so he was burned in 1847. The elm that was in Brentwood at the time is the spot where Hunter was incinerated. The English Church was adverse to having everyone interpret the Scripture for themselves. Now, after the Coverdale Bible, in 1560, there was a new version produced in Geneva, and this is called the Geneva Bible. It was done by Protestants living there, and they also had marginal notes that were adverse to the rule in England. Many of them said things that were opposed to the English king. And so the Bishop's Bible then came into being, and this was for use in the English church, and this had all of the marginal notes omitted. This was the Bishop's Bible. The Catholic Church about this time also produced their own version in English in 1593, and this was the Douay-Rheims Bible. Now you can see that there were several different translations available for use in the church, from William Tyndale, Coverdale, Matthew Bible, Great Bible, Geneva Bible, Bishop's Bible, the Douay-Rheims Bible. Which one should you use? And the church officials became concerned that there were so many different translations, and so they approached King James and asked that a new standard version be produced that could be used in all of the churches. So King James appointed a committee from the Oxford University and the Cambridge University, and these men who were serving on the committee were informed that they were to come up with a new translation to be used by all of the churches, but they could not change an existing version unless it was a correction of a mistake. As a result of this, 9/10 of the New Testament was the work of William Tyndale. This new version that was produced in 1611 is normally known as the King James Version. Now, the only thing that King James had to do with it was the appointing of the committee. Now, when the Bible was actually printed, there were two different editions. There were two different printers that were used, and one is called the He version, and the other is called the She version. And this is taken from the book of Ruth. Ruth has gone to the threshing floor, has met with Boaz. Boaz said that she should go back into the city with her mother, and he gave her some barley to take with her. And then the text says, he went into the city. Well, the other text says, she went into the city. So that is one of the basic differences. But there were more than 200 variations between these two editions, as well as some mistakes. Also included was the Apocrypha. Now, the Apocrypha is made up of books written between the Old and the New Testament that were used by the early church, but were not included as part of the canon by the Protestants. But this was included in the first King James Version. There have been many major revisions of the King James: 1629, 1638, 1729, 1762, and then the 1769 revision by Benjamin Bilney, also known as the Oxford Standard Edition. That's the one that is still in use today. So you notice that the latest revision was in 1769. When the King James Version was published in 1611, hardly anyone spoke the language that was used in the King James. The only ones that did so were those that had made their way to the United States and lived in the New England area. Now, if the revisions had been made several times, then why didn't they keep up with the revision? Because words change in meaning over time. Our grammar changes. And so it should have been a matter of every few years to come up with a new translation so that the people could understand it. The King James Version, in my estimation, was made from an inferior Greek text. This is known as the received text, but is basically a single copy of the Greek New Testament. There have been thousands of changes from 1611 to 1769, but if we still use the version of 1769, this means that many changes needed to be done. And finally, in 1881, a group of scholars from America and England worked on a revised text. In England, this was known as the English Revised Version, and in America, it was known as the American Standard Version. The American Revised Version was published in 1901. The reason for this is that there was an agreement before the translation was begun that the English version would be published 20 years before the American version. And so the Americans couldn't publish theirs then until 1901. The text that has made the biggest difference has been the Revised Standard Version. This was published in 1952. Many other versions, especially of the New Testament, were made. If I'm not mistaken, there's something like 80 different New Testament translations that were made over the years. But none of them had as great an impact as the Revised Standard Version. In fact, one of my colleagues at Brandeis University, and who later taught at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, made the comment that when he got hold of a Revised Standard Version and read it, he was saved because he could finally understand what the text said. Now, the New American Standard Version came out in 1971, the New King James Version in 1982, and this continued the translation received text, or the Textus Receptus. It still followed the single Greek text. The New Revised Standard Version was published in 1989. The New American Bible was a Catholic translation that was produced from the Jerusalem Bible that was written in French. They translated from the Greek and Hebrew rather than the Latin Vulgate. So this is a major improvement of the text for the Catholic Church. The New English Bible was published in England in 1970, and the Revised English Version in 1989. The Good News Bible, which is today's English version, was published in 1976. Now you notice that several new translations had come out. And because of the Revised Standard Version, there were many more conservative scholars who felt that the Orthodox Church should come up with a translation that would be closer to the meaning that the American or the English theologians held to. And so they went to their leaders in the Reformed Church and asked, can't we come up with a new translation? And so this was started. Many different scholars from the conservative evangelical organizations were asked to participate. I was asked to translate the books of Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, along with Howard Irvin from Oral Roberts University. We began work in 1967 to do that translation, and then when we were in the book of Ezra, Howard became ill and was not able to continue working with me, so I finished up Ezra and Nehemiah. I worked on parts of the NIV for a period of 10 years, and I had figured up at one time that in committee, away from home, I had spent a full year in the translation. This was published as the New International Version, and this was the middle ground between the word-for-word approach and a thought-for-thought approach. When we talk about translations, we have to recognize that there are different philosophies involved in the translation. Do we want to be as close as we can be to the original text so that the grammar, the order of the words are similar to the original text? Or do we want to say it the way that we would say it now? And that would be a thought-for-thought translation. Well, the New King James Version is a formal translation. The Good News Bible is a thought-for-thought translation. And the New International Version is somewhere in the middle. And there are several other translations that came along. The New Century Version in 1987, the Contemporary English Version in 1995. This was a simplified thought-for-thought approach. Also, the New International Reader's Version was published in 1996. This was a third grade level for reading. This was produced mainly for the issuing of the scripture to the lower grade students, but also for the use of prisons, because the reading level of most of the people in prison is at the third grade level. So I worked on a committee for the revision of this in the Old Testament, and we did half of the Old Testament into the New International Reader's Version. Many of you might be familiar with the Message by Eugene Peterson, which was published in 2002, and this reads like a paraphrase. Today's New International Version came out in 2001, and that is an attempt to revise the NIV using the best of contemporary biblical scholarship and changes in the English language. As part of this, one of the dictionary companies were approached to see how do we now say this in contemporary English. For instance, we don't say mankind anymore. We don't say human, but what is it that we now use? So we tried to figure out, this is the way it is said in the 2001 English. The English Standard Version also came out in 2001, and this is a word-for-word translation based on the Revised Standard Version. The Holman Christian Standard Bible was published in 2004, and this is a word-for-word approach unless clarity and readability demand a more idiomatic translation. And then finally, the New English Translation came out in 1998, and this is an electronic version. Now we have all of these new translations that are available, and the task is to try to find one that is best. And often I will have students come to me and they will ask, what is the best translation? Well, that depends. How do you want to use this translation? Are you wanting to learn what the Greek and Hebrew says? Well, then you want something like the New King James. Do you want something that is very readable, that you enjoy reading? Then you may want the Good News Bible or the Message, which is a paraphrase. In the book by Fee and Stewart, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, they have a chapter on Bible translation. And their conclusion is that the most accurate translation at this time is the New International Version, published in 2012. Now, the later ones that we've come out, like today's New International Version, they've also gone to a type of inclusive language, where instead of saying he or she, they will go to they. But the best translation is the 2012 edition of the New International Version.